All right, so get ready to dive into some serious geopolitical comedy.
Comedy.
I mean, where else do you put a story about renaming the Gulf of Mexico?
Right.
You heard that right, folks. Our deep dive today is all about Donald Trump's recent and, let's be honest, utterly baffling campaign promise to rename the Gulf of Mexico to, wait for it, the Gulf of America.
It's really a fascinating case study, isn't it?
It is.
Not just in terms of like the audacity of the idea, but
Yeah.
also, what it might reveal about how political messaging works, particularly when it comes to appealing to a certain sense of national pride.
Okay, so for anyone just tuning in,
Yeah.
this isn't some alternate reality.
Yeah.
This is real life 2025. And Trump is back on the campaign trail throwing out ideas that, well, let's just say they're generating a lot of buzz.
And buzz is the operative word here.
Yeah.
Because whether you find it hilarious or horrifying or maybe a bit of both,
Right.
there's no denying that Trump has a knack for grabbing headlines.
So let's rewind to the scene of the crime. Trump's in Florida, a state he knows well, and he's holding a press conference.
Right.
He's talking about all sorts of things, foreign policy, trade deals, the usual.
Mm-hmm.
And then almost casually, he drops this bombshell about renaming the Gulf of Mexico.
And it wasn't just a passing comment either.
No.
He goes on to describe the Gulf as very beautiful, the perfect representation of American power.
Yeah.
And, well, you get the picture.
The subtext is pretty thick, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
It's like he's saying, America's great, and this big, beautiful body of water should reflect that greatness.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting because renaming a geographical feature,
Yeah.
especially one as significant as the Gulf of Mexico,
Right, yeah.
isn't just some quirky branding exercise.
No.
It's a symbolic act, one that carries historical and political weight.
So we're not just talking about slapping a new label on a map.
No.
We're talking about an attempt to reshape, at least symbolically, America's relationship with the world, and particularly with its neighbors.
Precisely. And that's why this story has legs. Yeah.
It's not just about the humor, although there's plenty of that to go around.
Of course.
It's about what this proposal reveals about how certain political figures try to tap into deeper anxieties and aspirations, how they use symbols and language to promote their agenda.
Okay. So we've got Trump, the master of the grand gesture.
Right.
Making a move that's simultaneously hilarious and potentially unsettling, but let's not forget, this isn't happening in a vacuum.
Right.
He's also making other, shall we say, bold pronouncements on the world stage.
Oh, yes. The Gulf of America is just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Uh-huh.
We have to look at it alongside his other statements, like his demand that NATO members increase their defense spending to a whopping 5% of their GDP, or his threats of military action against Panama and Greenland to gain control of the Panama Canal and, well, Greenland.
It's like he's playing a real-life game of Risk,
Yeah.
but with actual countries and not just little plastic pieces.
Yeah.
And he's decided to go all in on the America First strategy. And that's a really important point to consider because this renaming proposal, when viewed alongside those other pronouncements, starts to paint a picture of a very specific foreign policy agenda,
Yeah.
one that prioritizes American dominance and unilateral action.
So it's not just about a name.
No.
It's about signaling a shift in how America interacts with the world. And that shift, well, it's causing quite a stir, both domestically and internationally.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, you can imagine the reactions have been pretty colorful, ranging from utter disbelief to outright condemnation. And then, of course, there's the satirical response, which is a whole other layer of fascinating commentary.
Yeah, because let's be honest, this whole situation is ripe for satire.
It is.
I mean, there's already a podcast out there called Gulf of Mexico or
Yeah.
How I Learned to Ignore the World Map. I'm not even kidding.
It's a classic example of how humor can be used to both highlight the absurdity of a situation and also to encourage critical thinking, because sometimes laughter is the best way to make sense of the nonsensical.
So we've got Trump the Gulf, a renaming proposal that's both hilarious and potentially worrisome, and a whole lot to unpack. What's next? Where do we even begin?
Well, I think the first step is to understand why this idea, as outlandish as it seems, might actually resonate with a certain segment of the population. Because to dismiss it as mere absurdity would be to miss the opportunity to understand the deeper currents at play here.
Okay, so let's dive into what's the appeal? Is it just about national pride, or is there something more going on? And what are the potential consequences of this kind of rhetoric, both domestically and on the world stage?
I think it's more than just simple pride.
Right.
To grasp the appeal of this Gulf of America idea, you have to consider like the anxieties and desires it speaks to.
Okay.
For some, it might be a longing for a time when America felt unquestionably dominant on the world stage.
You're talking about that Make America Great Again sentiment, right?
Exactly.
The idea that somehow America's lost its way and we need to reclaim our former glory.
Right, and renaming a major geographical feature.
Yeah.
Well, it's a pretty bold way to signal that reclamation. It's like saying, we're back and we're not afraid to assert our influence.
But the thing is, the Gulf of Mexico isn't some unclaimed territory.
Right.
It's bordered by multiple countries, not just the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a whole historical aspect.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the name Gulf of Mexico has been around for centuries. It's on maps and textbooks. It's how people around the world know this body of water.
Yeah, that's where the lack of historical precedent becomes so striking.
Right.
We rarely see major geographical names being changed, and for good reason.
Yeah.
These names often reflect complex histories, cultural influences, and established international conventions.
So Trump's proposal is basically tossing all that aside in favor of a name that, well, let's be honest, sounds a bit like a theme park.
Yeah.
I mean, Gulf of America. It's
Right.
almost too perfect, isn't it? Like something out of a satirical novel about American hubris.
And that's precisely why it sparks such a strong satirical response, because
Right.
it taps into this sense of disbelief. This feeling that we've entered a realm where logic and reason no longer apply.
And the satire isn't just about poking fun at the absurdity of the name itself.
Right.
It's about highlighting the potential consequences of this kind of thinking,
Yeah.
this disregard for history and international norms.
Right. It's about using humor to hold up a mirror to those in power.
Yeah.
To expose the flaws in their logic and the potential dangers of their actions.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing so, it invites us, the audience, to think critically about the world around us.
So we've got this fascinating interplay happening between political maneuvering, symbolic gestures, and the power of satire. But let's zoom in on the international implications for a moment, specifically how this Gulf of America idea is playing out in America's relationship with Mexico.
Well, you can imagine that it hasn't exactly been met with open arms in Mexico City.
Okay.
The sources suggest that it's being viewed as a deliberate provocation, a blatant disregard for Mexican sovereignty and history.
Which, given the already complex relationship between the U.S. and Mexico, is like pouring gasoline on a smoldering fire.
Right.
Oh, we've got ongoing tensions over migration, trade, drug trafficking. This renaming proposal just adds another layer of friction to an already sensitive situation.
And it's worth noting that Trump chose to make this announcement in Florida, a state with a large Latinx population, which adds another layer of complexity to the whole situation. Was it a calculated move to appeal to a certain segment of his base, or was it just another example of his, shall we say, less than subtle approach to diplomacy?
It's hard to say for sure, but the timing and location of the announcement definitely raised some eyebrows. And then there's the fact that he coupled this renaming proposal with threats towards Panama and Greenland.
Yeah.
It's like he's trying to send a message not just to Mexico, but to the entire world.
And that message seems to be, America's back and we're not afraid to use our power to get what we want. But the question is, what are the potential consequences of this kind of aggressive posturing? Does it actually achieve its intended goals, or does it just create more instability and conflict?
So we've got Trump on this renaming spree, it seems.
Yeah.
Not just with the Gulf of Mexico,
Right.
but also eyeing the Panama Canal and Greenland.
Yeah.
It's almost comical
Right.
if the potential consequences weren't so serious.
Yeah.
So it begs the question, is this just Trump being Trump?
Mm-hmm.
You know, a showman grabbing headlines? Or does this signal like a more profound shift in American foreign policy?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that has experts and world leaders alike just scratching their heads. Because while Trump's antics might generate laughs on, late-night talk shows,
Right.
the reality is that his actions have the potential to create real-world ripples.
Ripples, I say we're talking tsunamis here.
Yeah,
This kind of aggressive posturing could destabilize entire regions.
absolutely.
Think about the potential impact on U.S.-Mexico relations alone. We're
Right.
talking about two countries with deep economic and cultural ties, not to mention a shared border.
Exactly. And this renaming proposal, whether it's intended as a serious policy move or just a publicity stunt, throws a wrench into that already complex relationship.
Yeah.
It feeds into existing tensions, creates distrust, and makes it that much harder to find common ground on issues like trade, migration, and security.
And it's not just Mexico that's watching.
Right.
Other countries are taking note of how the U.S. is behaving on the world stage.
Yeah.
If America, the self-proclaimed leader of the free world, starts throwing its weight around and disregarding international norms, Well, it sends a message.
Yeah.
And that message might not be the one we want to be sending.
It emboldens other countries to do the same. It creates a climate where where diplomacy takes a backseat to aggression.
Yeah.
And that's a dangerous path, one that could lead to more conflict and instability in an already volatile world.
So while we might chuckle at the absurdity of renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America,
Right.
we can't afford to ignore the bigger picture. It's about more than just a name on a map.
Yeah.
It's about the erosion of international norms, the rise of nationalist rhetoric, and the potential for serious consequences down the line.
It's about understanding that actions have consequences, even seemingly ridiculous ones. And it's about recognizing that we as citizens have a responsibility to be informed, to engage in critical thinking, and to hold our leaders accountable for their actions.
So what could we do? I mean, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this.
Sure.
We're talking about geopolitics, international relations, the future of the world order. It's a lot to process.
It is a lot, but it's not insurmountable. The first step is awareness, understanding what's at stake.
Right.
Then it's about engaging in thoughtful dialogue, challenging assumptions, and seeking out diverse perspectives.
And maybe finding a little bit of humor along the way. Because sometimes laughter is the only way to keep from going completely mad in a world that seems to be getting crazier by the day.
I think you're right about that. After all, if we can't laugh at the absurdity of it all, then what hope do we have? But remember, laughter is just the beginning. It's the spark that ignites curiosity, critical thinking, and the desire to make a difference.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the curious case of the Gulf of America, I'd encourage you, our listener, to keep asking questions, to stay engaged, and to never underestimate the power of your own voice, because in a world where the absurd can quickly become reality, it's more important than ever to be informed, to be thoughtful, and to speak up for what you believe in. Thanks for joining us.